First You Think is a not-for-profit ministry of the First Unitarian Church of Des Moines. Support us at ucdsm.org today.
Our monthly theme for February is borders and boundaries. And these two words are synonyms, or used to be, and they both mean the outer edge, the bound or limit of something. In recent years, though, the words have come to be used in different ways. A border is more often now used to mean the kind of line that shuts people out. We've come to think of a border as something to be crossed or surmounted or maybe expanded. And boundaries, like your personal boundaries, are something to be maintained and respected and upheld. So, Doctors Without Borders is a wonderful organization and a wonderful concept, providing necessary medical care without regard to the political or social borders that function to limit access to care. But Doctors Without Boundaries? Sounds like a bad reboot of the TV show House MD. Some lines it's good to cross. Other lines are better respected. You've probably heard the verse by Edwin Markham titled Outwitted. He drew a circle that shut me out, heretic, rebel, a thing to flout. But love and I had the wit to win. We drew a circle that took him in. In those 4 lines, we see both the good and the bad of the lines that we draw, the boundaries and the borders that we put up. Some lines shut people out. Other lines hold people together. And sometimes it's the same line, holding us together and keeping out them. Our Unitarian Universalist Seminary, Meadville Lombard in Chicago, has a requirement that students design a focused project to carry out during their internship in which the student shows how they cross borders in their ministry, borders of race, culture, gender, or generation. Crossing borders is a crucial component of building a more just and harmonious world, a more beloved community. Meadville Lombard's course offerings also include a class called Healthy Boundaries, Healthy Ministry. Those lines that shut people out, we have to find ways to erase them or at least move across them with greater facility. Boundaries, on the other hand, are a good thing. Having good boundaries is a part of being psychologically and emotionally healthy, and it's a key to effective leadership. What I'd like to do today is first talk about good boundaries, what that means and why it is so helpful to have them. And then we'll take a look at borders, the lines we draw that shut people out. The objective is some greater clarity on what sorts of lines we should be looking to cross and what sort to respect and uphold. Having good boundaries is also called being self-defined, differentiated, or having a well-developed self. Good boundaries are what let you be guided by what you think of yourself rather than other people's opinions. Without those boundaries, your identity merges with the people around you. You are more susceptible to groupthink. On the one hand, you're more controlled by other people's judgments, and on the other hand, you're also more controlling, more devoted to actively or passively trying to control others. The self-differentiated person, on the other hand, is more able to say, I'm going to do me, you do you. I'm not interested in judging you or in your judgments of me, but I am interested in non-judgmentally watching how we each are and looking for ways we might harmonize or complement each other. There's not a right answer or a blueprint for how we should work together or play together or be together. Rather, as I do me and you do you, I'm open to being surprised, to discover unexpected creative ways that our different gifts can synchronize or contribute in different ways to a common goal. Many psychologists note that a person's degree of self-differentiation, while it probably has some genetic component, is largely influenced by family relationships during childhood and adolescence. Once established, The level of self-boundaries tends to often be set for life. It can be changed, but it's hard. It takes a structured and long-term effort to change it. People with poor boundaries may be chameleons or bullies, or vacillate back and forth. Chameleons depend so heavily on the acceptance and approval of others that they quickly adjust what they think, say, and do to please others. Bullies likewise depend on acceptance and approval of others, but pursue their need by dogmatically proclaiming that what others should be like, pressuring them to conform. Disagreement is a threat to both chameleons and bullies alike. In both cases, there's a felt need for conformity, whether by conforming to others or pressuring them to conform to me. A third type of poorly differentiated person would be the extreme rebel who routinely opposes the position of others. Reactionary opposition is just as much a way of being controlled by others as reactionary agreement is. We are each unique and bring unique gifts and perspectives to the table, of course. But when we don't have good boundaries, we blur our own uniqueness and seek to minimize others, or both. Now, it is true that I find George Herbert Mead's idea of the self to be important and helpful. Mead said the self was a generalized other. We do create our sense of self from generalizing what we learn about others. But that generalizing is a creative, even if largely unconscious, activity. We all come up with different generalizations. And what's more, we're always learning. The self is always growing and changing. But again, this need not be, and for the most part shouldn't be, a process driven by a felt need for conformity. Of course, we are all, as our seventh principle says, interconnected. We depend on each other. But a person with good boundaries can stay calm and clear-headed in the face of conflict, criticism, and rejection. They can assess criticism in the context of their own long-term principles and considered values rather than only reacting from the emotions that they're feeling in the moment. Boundaries keep you contained rather than a puddle of emotions and needs for acceptance. Boundaries thus afford integrity, the ability to live from a more or less consistent set of more or less thoughtful values, rather than being pulled this way and that by the shifting currents of opinion and judgments of others. Last month's theme was vow, and the packet for that month included exercises for drawing out of yourself and articulating your great life vow. Implicit is the idea that other people will have different vows for their life. Keeping your eye on your vow while also appreciating and collaborating with those with different vows, that's good boundaries. In a couple, when the partners are self-defined, they can each talk about what they're thinking and listen carefully, rather than taking on anxiety about the partner's issue and reacting out of their anxiety. Each can appreciate the other's decision-making strengths while also able to think things through for themselves. Neither assumes that the other generally knows best, but looks at each situation fresh. They can talk about their fears or concerns without expecting the other to fix or solve them, but simply because sharing our fears helps us think more clearly about them. When they bring their anxieties to each other, the interaction doesn't escalate the anxiety. Their boundaries keep the anxiety contained and thus more manageable. Each is a resource for the other, emotionally available without either fixing or blaming. It's helpful here to recall the distinction between a request and a demand. The difference between a request and a demand is in whether you're upset if it isn't met. Sometimes it's clear that a demand is being made. Do what I'm saying or I'm going to be upset or angry. That's a demand. Other times, what is presented as a request is not revealed to really have been a demand until after the answer is no. But the extent to which you are upset if the answer is no is the extent to which there was some demand in your request. You might hide the upset, the anger or disappointment, pretend you're not upset, but if you are, then you were demanding, not simply requesting. When we have good boundaries, when our perceived worth doesn't depend on things going our way, we can make true requests. That is, requests which, if answered no, we can roll with that answer without getting upset or anxious. Good boundaries are not a barrier to caring, but are a protection of our integrity. They don't make us detached or aloof, but allow us to be present to a situation without taking anything personally, without taking on the anxiety. The notion of being a non-anxious presence in the midst of anxiety once seemed self-contradictory to me. My strategy for being present was to show that I was just as worried or scared or angry about the situation as anybody else. And my strategy for being non-anxious was to check out and become detached and emotionally distant. But the reality is that taking on someone else's anxiety isn't really being present to it, nor is detaching and not being present to it being non-anxious. Detachment is one way that anxiety manifests. The only way to be truly present is to be non-anxious. And the only way to be truly non-anxious is to be present. And that requires being self-differentiated, having good boundaries that allow you to know that your worth, your dignity, the worthwhileness of your life is not threatened by whatever mess of which you might happen to find yourself in the middle. And that's where I'll pick up from after our interlude. Having good boundaries solves the 84th problem. Do you know what the 84th problem is? I've told the parable before in a sermon last May, and it's worth retelling. The Buddha comes to town, and a farmer comes to see him and starts complaining about his problems. His wife this, and his children that, and the ox is sick, and the soil is poor. There hasn't been enough rain, and if there were, the roof would leak, and the people to whom he sells his rice are cheating him. And the Buddha finally stops him and says, "You have 83 problems." The farmer says, that sounds about right. How do I fix them? The Buddha says, you'll always have 83 problems. Maybe you solve one or it goes away on its own, but another pops up to take its place. Always 83 problems. Farmer says, well, what good are you? The Buddha says, I can help you with the 84th problem. Farmer says, what's the 84th problem? Buddha says, you think you should have no problems. For the person with good boundaries, problems don't bother them. Problems arise, one responds to them as well as one can. This is life. Whether you call them problems or challenges, there's always the next one to meet. Having good boundaries doesn't keep out your 83 problems, but it does keep out the 84th problem. Your problems then don't define you. You aren't consumed with the thought that you shouldn't be having this problem. The 84th problem is the extra. Your problems or challenges are enough by themselves. You don't need to add anything extra. But we often do add extra problems to our problems. Whenever we're annoyed by the problem, when we think it's wrong that the problem exists, when we let the problem trigger our reactivity and upset our equanimity, we are adding extra problem to our problem. Good boundaries keep out the extra bit. Life is problems, or we'd have nothing to do with ourselves, no reason for being. This is a very ancient spiritual insight and teaching. All things belong. On the one hand, being mindful that all things belong eases anxiety, irritation, annoyance, anger. On the other hand, it's also true that if all things belong, then so does your own anger and anxiety. This too is recognized in ancient spiritual teachings, though the very modern perspective of evolutionary psychology helps us understand it. Anxiety belongs because our ancestors needed it. Anxiety about that lion prompted them to run away. Anxiety about a brewing storm prompted them to seek shelter. Homo sapiens emerged with a particularly advanced capacity to worry about the future, to imagine dangers that were not immediately visible. This was probably driven by the process that made us not only social animals, as wolves and orcas and emperor penguins and chimpanzees and many others are, but ultra-social, able to adaptively cooperate at an extraordinary level because of an astonishing capacity to imagine ourselves into another person's situation, grasp what they're trying to do so we can help them do it. We were motivated to be helpful because we were able to imagine the future, able to join in a common project where we all imagined where that project was going. Farther into the future and in more detail we can imagine than in other species. I would help you because I imagined a future in which you would help me, and that capacity allowed systems of reciprocal altruism to begin to form. And our symbolic language emerged. We were able to communicate to create shared imaginary futures and then cooperate to bring them about, which is all very wonderful, but there's a rub. Our ability to imagine the future and to be goaded to appropriate action by a little anxiety about the future can easily go too far. Evolution gave us these goads, but didn't give us very good mechanisms for turning them off when they're no longer helpful. Our brains were built to worry, and it's very easy for them to fall into a pattern of worrying even when it does us no good and only produces chronic stress and anxiety. Making matters worse, the futures that we imagine aren't just worries about the weather or predators or food sources. Our imagined futures are heavily peopled. Can Bob be counted on? Was Sandra lying and she's going to stab me in the back? Our brains evolved to negotiate the fantastically complex balancing act of wanting and needing to cooperate, but also to guard against being taken advantage of, balancing the costs and risks of cooperation against possible benefits. The balancing act is carried out through, or manifests as, our sense of fairness. We are as ultra-social as ants or bees, but for us, our sense of fairness is the crucial regulator of our sociability. My brain is built to monitor possible future scenarios of people being unfair to me, and whether they think that I'm unfair to them, or whether they'll think that I'll think that they're unfair to me. It's exhausting, or rather it seems like it would be exhausting, but in fact our brains seem to rarely tire of thinking about fairness. Our ability to think about fairness in such complicated ways is also our beauty as a species. So we are built to worry about what other people think and to want to be in agreement with them. And yet the more clear we are about who we are, the less need we'll have to be self-protective, i.e. defensive. Ironically, the better your boundary is, the less need you have for a protective border wall of defenses. That is, Those who are self-differentiated don't have to be self-protective. When difference and conflict are not a threat to your sense of self, then ego mechanisms don't get triggered, and the walls that block empathy don't go up. When boundaries are solid, borders don't have to be. When we're comfortable with ourselves, we can let people in. We can take down the walls that shut them out. So, how are your boundaries, would you say? Today, after the service, I'm going to ask you to pair off with one other person next to you in line at the refreshment table or anywhere. Pair off with one other person and exchange your self-assessment of your boundaries. Would you say your boundaries are excellent, pretty good, a bit of a struggle for you sometimes? How are your boundaries in just a quick and brief assessment? Pair off and share that with one other person after today's service. When we don't require conformity of ourselves or of others, we can be free to connect with and work with very different people, appreciating and not being threatened by their difference, while also appreciating and not being scared by our own differences. This is true on a personal level, and it's also true on the national level. As a nation, the U.S. has lost its boundary. We have no clear sense of who we are as a people. We are, as it were, out of bounds. The old story that defined our nation was deeply problematic in many ways. It was a story shot through with patriarchal and supremacist assumptions, and the critique that helped dismantle the old story was well warranted. But a new and better story has not emerged. In the interim, so many of us don't know who we are, don't know what America is or means. In compensation for our lack of boundary definition, the national psyche instead has turned to border protection. A lot of us want to put up a wall, that blocking empathy, blocking compassion, blocking our own growth, blocking the very connections that our spirits crave. As our national norms break down, lines are crossed. Lines of civility are crossed. And those lines were helpful. David Brooks once wrote, "Those lines," he said, "help political leaders hold two opposing ideas in their heads simultaneously. The first is that your political opponents are wrong about many things and should be defeated in elections. The second is you still need them. You still need them to check your excesses, compensate for your blind spots, correct your mistakes." But it's gotten easier and easier to cross the lines that held our leaders in a system that helped them know how to work together amidst their disagreements, find and build on a common ground while respecting the beneficial role of political opposition. Crossing those lines makes it harder and harder to cross other lines, the ones that exclude and shut out, the lines of enmity and othering. The task before us is daunting. But as Rabbi Tarfon says, do not be daunted. You are not obligated to complete the task, nor are you free to abandon it. The task is to strengthen your boundary, clarify our principles, our values, our vow. Know our story and stick to it. Develop equanimity in our integrity. Bring our non-anxious presence. Only thus will we be able then to cross borders and replace walls with bridges and join hands and end the loneliness. May it be so. Amen.